Plague surgeons were once the apothecaries of the 14th Legion, but since becoming followers of Nurgle, they now spread diseases and death with their corrupted surgical instruments. This guy's a pretty cool looking model, and in the current edition, Plague surgeons can bring back destroyed Plague Marines, and they get enhanced hit rolls on targets that they choose. Because these Plague surgeons used to be apothecaries, I thought it would be a great idea to paint this guy with white armor. And in this video, I'm going to be focusing on how I painted the armor and the claw sections of this model, so let's get into it. Starting from a black primer, I first picked out what areas I wanted to paint green. In this case, that was the shoulders and the knee plate. I painted two thin layers using Death Guard green to get that solid coverage, and I really like how the green ends up being more of a secondary color on this model as opposed to the primary color. It contrasts really nicely against the white armor and bronze trim. After that, I painted the white armor using Vallejo Ivory White. I don't usually have to work with pure white that often because I primarily paint Death Guard and Black Legion, but I know from experience that a smooth base coat of white can be a little bit tricky to paint. I ended up just layering it on little by little, but looking back, I probably should have added a layer of light gray before jumping straight up to white. Regardless, I ended up getting pretty solid coverage after about three thin layers, which didn't take too long. I found the important part of this is patience and to let those layers completely dry before adding additional layers on top, because if you don't, the white armor can end up looking a little bit chalky. Next, I painted the trim with Balthazar Gold. This model doesn't have too much trim, so it wasn't too bad. Balthazar Gold covers nicely over black primer, so I only had to do one primary coat with some minor touch-ups after that. Now, the con of this is that painting trim that outlines white armor is really punishing when you make mistakes, so I tried to be as neat as possible here. Some of these trim sections were really thin though, so I had to use a pretty sharp brush to make sure to be as accurate as possible. Next, I washed the entire model using Agrex Earthshade, watered down by a tiny bit of water. Adding that little bit of water reduced the strength of the wash, so it would only slightly tint the white armor. Because we're working with white armor, I tried to be a little more precise with the wash by focusing the pigments in the recess areas and the many dents and divots in the armor. This really brought out the detail and made the armor look great without too much effort. After letting that completely dry, I wanted the armor to be a little more gritty, so I added some oil and rust stains. This was really simple. I just mixed whole red into Agrex Earthshade to slightly thicken up the wash, and then I painted this running out of the divots in the armor with a sharp brush. After that layer dried, I mixed a little bit of orange and repeated the step to add some additional color to make it look a little bit more like rust. This rust and grime looks really great against white armor. It's very visible, and I think that this is one of the coolest things about painting white Death Guard armor versus their traditional green armor. To finish up the white armor, I just did an additional recess shade and then called it there. With the armor done, I moved on to the claw section, starting with the base coats. This model has two different claw sections. For the main cloak, I went with a magenta color that I got by mixing purple and red, and for the other section, I went with a light gray color. As usual, I did two thin coats just to show you the second coat really does make a big difference. After I got those solid base coat colors, I then sketched out highlights on each cloth section using a brighter variant of the base coat color. For the magenta cloth, I just mixed in white with the magenta color to get my brighter color. And then for the gray cloth, I just mixed in a little bit more white to get a even brighter gray. After those highlights, I then focused my attention on the magenta cloth. I first added in a darker and more red shade of magenta as a glaze. I focused this primarily into the recesses and then some sections on the hood. This altered the color of the magenta to make it look a little bit more red and then added some depth into the shadows. This was followed by a slightly brighter magenta that I used to blend in the transitions between the dark shadows and the brighter highlights. After all of this, I ended with a final layer of highlights with a very bright magenta color. For the gray cloth, I thought that it looked a little bit too gray, so I decided to introduce brown into the shadows. I first sketched out my dark areas with a darker brown color, and then used a mid-tone gray to blend in the transitions between the brown and the gray. After that, I increased the brightness of the gray and then added some broad highlights and then ended with finer highlights using my size 1 Winsor and Newton brush. With the cloth wrapped up, I just had to finish the rest of the model. For the skin areas, I did a base coat wash and highlight using flat flesh, Druki Violet, and Kislev flesh. I also added a green tint to the pustules using a very watered down flat green. The vials were definitely fun to paint. I tried to give them some extra realness by adding white highlights to try and make them look like glass. I also added some gradients between mood green and a darker green color to make the liquid look a little bit glowy and toxic. I really like rust and oxidization on my Death Guard models. For oxidization, I just use Temple Guard Blue, water it down, and poke this into the recesses around all of the different textured surfaces on the trim. And then for the rust, I just use browns and oranges and paint this up in thin layers on the weapons. The last thing I did for this model was the base, and this was really simple. I just used fine ballast and glue. I leave a spot on the base right underneath the end of the sword to add some goopy texture, and I intentionally tried to make it look like that there was some goo dripping off the end of the sword into the goo spot, which I thought was a nice touch. Now, something that I really like about this basing scheme is that my entire army has the same basing scheme. So despite this model having white armor, he still fits in with the rest of my army. I think this is one of the advantages of having a distinct basing scheme is that you can experiment with different colors and paint models differently, but they still look like they're in the same family because they've got the same base. I really enjoyed painting this model. It was very fun and different trying to paint white Death Guard armor. If you want to go with this color scheme, I highly recommend it. It really does look fantastic, and the white armor stands out when viewing the model from the tabletop. My favorite part about this color scheme is that the grease and rust effects look awesome and grimdark against the white armor. I also enjoyed recess shading this model because the wash adds such high contrast against the white armor, making all of the details very readable. With that, I hope you enjoyed the video and that it gives you some ideas on how to paint your own epic looking Plague Surgeon. If you like the video, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one.